Good morning to all of you. I'm coming from a small country, Singapore, and when I listen to the three previous presentations, there is only one word I have: fear. And I think this is sort of the backbone of what I'm going to share with you in my short presentation about Asia. Of course, this is industrial innovation policy in East Asia, of course not mainland China and Australia. And when Mike asked me, as this old long-standing friend, to talk about Asia, I actually didn't know that I was going to a very difficult situation because, of course, it is an area with more than 800 million people and a few trillion dollars of GDP, but it's extremely diversified. And so talking about Asia, whatever I'm going to say, you always can find a counterexample. It is highly diversified from some of the richest states in the world, Singapore, Brunei, and Japan, over several industrialized middle-income countries, Thailand and Malaysia, which were mentioned by Xiaobo, to some of the poorest countries in the world, but also very big differences in demographics. I have some of the most rapidly aging populations, and that is an issue in industrial innovation policy, but also some countries with still a potentially high demographic dividend. So no general conclusions today. Yet, these countries have some common challenges. Like anybody else in the world, most of these countries are thinking about sustainability and global warming, and it may take very simple sort of threats, like in the country in which I live and where I'm a resident, Singapore, has calculated that with a very reasonable increase in sea levels, we will lose about 30% of our 700 square kilometers that we have. So it has some very real impact on the company. Digitalization, the management of data and the localization of data are big issues in many countries. Actually, Xiaobo was already indicating the restructuring of the supply chain, and actually that was also part of Bill's presentation. It is true that there is a lot more export from China into ASEAN, but that is partially to avoid countries of origin restrictions, and so some of it is not very high-tech, some of it is just finishing assembly in Vietnam, Thailand, and other places. But there are opportunities for supply chain restructuring. I think one of the major driving forces, and that's the reason why I used fear in my introduction, is that we are all of these countries are thinking about where to position themselves within what, how did you phrase it, Julia? De-risking. And Xiaobo used decoupling. By any other word, a rose still smells the same, yeah? To go back to your Shakespeare. The point is, whatever you call it, we see the world dividing up in two big groups, and the choice that one has to make, or the choices that one have to make, will drive to a large extent the industrial innovation policies. But then for quite a few countries, there are enormous attractive opportunities through the development of new international networks, institutions, and alliances. And I can use a lot of these abbreviations, such as BRI, that Xiaobo was referring to, BRICS, that have, I guess, next week a big meeting in Russia, the AIIB, and many other things, where you can see that a part of the world is rebuilding, or is not rebuilding, is building new international institutions and networks. One can make a distinction between Northeast Asia and the rest, and I would say in Northeast Asia, which for me is mainly Japan and the Republic of Korea, one should not forget that they had never given up on industrial policy. We may have given up that here in Europe, in the United States, elsewhere, but the nice word that I learned in the 80s or the 90s about Japan, administrative guidance by the government, has never stopped. So it's not that there is a revival of industrial policy, but it is a continued continuity. To a large extent, it's still focused on upstream science and technology development, similar to what Bill was actually explaining. And in the same way that to Bill, what Bill was mentioning about US, there's this big issue of multi-agency coordination and international collaboration. There's virtually no international collaboration between these countries, and it is growing, but there is very little international collaboration. There is a new focus on applied development and stimulation of startups, and in Japan, although we have to be careful, we have a change of prime minister, so that may have an impact on what the policies are there, but under the Kishida government, it was about realizing people's well-being through the use of science and technology. In other words, impact on society. While in the Republic of Korea, it's about technological sovereignty to overcome the consequences of geopolitical divides and sanctions. I would say a relatively recent observation that I make is that there is a realization that industrial policies have begun to spill across national, or in the case of the EU, supranational borders. And so that there is a need for new alliances, new concepts like friendshoring, sources of materials and components from trusted trade partners, and there are a number of these alliances that are have been formed recently, the Chip for Alliance or the Group of Seven for Critical Materials, etc. Of course, you can ask yourself, if you see the saga of Nippon Steel in the United States, whether your friends are really friends. But I leave it, and there are in the room here people that know more about about Korea, Republic of Korea, and Japan. So if there are any common contributions there. Let me then now focus on Southeast Asia a little bit more and on Australia. And I have 3 quotes here, and I have a longer list of quotes, but that actually given a feeling for what people think about industrial policy. And one shouldn't forget that here we talk about countries when I have Australia, and I will later talk also a little bit about Hong Kong, where there was actually a strong drive towards free trade, no industrial policy, we leave it to the markets, etc. But Anthony Albanese, the Prime Minister of Australia, when he introduced the program that I will talk a little bit later on the 10th of April of this year, he says, nations are drawing an explicit link between economic security and national security. This is not old-fashioned protectionism or isolationism, it's just simply the new competition. And you can sort of see in the polite diplomatic way that he says it, the fear that is ongoing. Secondly, Tengku Abdulaziz, who was the Malaysian Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry, ASEAN member states have emerged as the biggest beneficiaries of supply chain realignment amid rising political tensions, but there are challenges in the longer term. The rise of industrial policy in the United States and the European Union could disrupt the flow of investments into Southeast Asia and fragmentation of the global trading. I'm not going to go further in that, but PM Wong, our new, I say here DPM and PM designate, but he's actually currently our PM since May, but he made this comment in 2023. The new realities of business are driven not just by economic logic, but also by geopolitical alignment and national security. So you see, and I can give you umpteen statements of this nature of people who look at what's going on in the United States, China, and Europe and say, we are scared. So what have people been doing? And I have here 4 examples. I can't say that is what Asia does. That is not the case. But I can look at Singapore, Indonesia, Australia, and Hong Kong. If I look, and I kept it to 1 or 2 slides per country, but I'm willing to go into more details, and I guess there are people here in the room that can provide more details. But if you look at Jokowi's Indonesia, President Jokowi, you see I could call it a turn to resource-based industrialization, but actually it's a return, because under the Suharto administration, there was also something like resource-based industrialization. And if you see, I mean, what he did in his first term, he was basically using some of the legislation that Yudhoyono had already put in place to localize the mining sector. Basically say, get control over your mining resources. Examples are the fact that all expiring foreign oil and gas contracts went to Pertamina, and then there is the saga of Freeport's Grasberg mine, where after some fights, well, administrative fights, Indonesia took about 51.4% of the ownership of that big Freeport mine. But it was really focused on, let's get control over the mining industry. The second term, however, saw an interesting evolution, a focus on industrializing mineral resources. And I guess that most of you will have been reading about the decree not to export any more nickel ore, and basically say, we force nickel importers, primarily from China, I should say, to invest in downstream melting sector in Indonesia. And the goal is not only to get control over the nickel sector and do also the downstream, but basically say this is then the source of a battery production industry, a battery production and mining industry that will be based on superior technology, advanced technology. It did require actually investment by Chinese capital. It did require favoring domestic extractive interests and the political rise of them. It required the re-centralization of economic governance, and it required a dismantling of accountability mechanisms to ensure the distribution of land and licenses. So there was actually a lot of work to actually get this done. The positive result is, as reported, a tenfold increase in the value of nickel exports, but the negative sides of it is negative externalities, of course, the devastating effect on waterways and forests, the dependence on coal-fired electricity plants, and shaky working conditions. But also an over-reliance on a small number of Chinese investors, in particular at Tsingshan, and a geographically very focused development. So in other words, a few parts of the country benefited, but not necessarily the country as a whole. It will be interesting to see what the Prabowo administration will do. It looks to me that Prabowo is much more oriented towards international relations and is investing in the military, which actually is probably needed. So it may be that there is a shift of resources there, and some of these developments will take more time. Australia, I actually cannot talk too much about it because what I'm talking about is currently in the parliament, and it may still be amended, right? But Albanese has clearly moved from Australia being a free trade country and a laissez-faire approach to the economy towards the Future Made in Australia Act. And that Future Made of Australia Act, which was introduced in Parliament in April of this year, but is currently in discussion in the Senate in Australia, it identifies a role for the government to facilitate industrial investment, and indicating that government interventions are justified when economic incentives are not aligned with the broader national interest objectives. And that is, of course, a very broad statement. Sources of market failures are externalities, security, and knowledge spillovers in infant industry. And currently, there's about US $15 billion allocated over the 5 years, and it is nominally focused on the transition to a more carbon neutral economy and taking advantage of its natural resources to better integrate in the global green economic supply chain. The reality is that half of that $15 billion will go to the mining and extraction sector, which is very strong in Australia. What that global green economic supply chain then means, I'm not 100% sure how that fits, but it's clear that they want to have a more resilient supply chain in critical minerals and goods associated with green energy. The associate with green energy is a bit of a puzzle to me. I have to say that I have to declare a small conflict of interest here, because I'm in the board of one of the companies that has one of the two remaining refineries in Australia. And it's clear that we are benefiting from it, because as soon as the added value per barrel is going down in our refinery, we have actually a security system whereby the government compensates whatever losses we would make. So we have de-risked completely the production or the refining of oils. But we're benefiting there from the fact that Australia wants to have future made in Australia. We only have 2 refineries left, and we are one of the beneficiaries of the whole thing. So sorry for that conflict of interest. Critiques raised by challengers is, hey, come on, $15 billion. We just heard $500 billion by the United States, and whatever EU is going to invest, maybe not 800 billion, but maybe half of it, right? I mean, this is peanuts, right? How do you balance commitment to free trade and national security considerations? A fair question. Do you have absorptive capacity locally? What is your without a domestic industry to ensure offtake? Sorry, can we do this? And actually, Australian companies have no tradition of investing in R&D, and Australian universities, sorry for my colleagues, are extremely bad at commercializing their research and outputs. Third example, Singapore, country that I know very well, country that has no problems with industrial policy since 1962, and actually since 1962, Singapore has had industrial policy, committed to free trade, but have no qualms about supporting local industries if needed. I would say that there are 4 pillars of the current industrial innovation policies. That is, first of all, something that I've talked about in the past, these industry transformation maps, where the government, to get in a tripartite consultation, government, employers and unions, and actually I should say universities also, worked on an in-depth analysis of how you form 23 sectors. There was some criticism actually that there are too many sectors, and so at some moment in time the government clustered them in 6 clusters. But actually the transformation maps exist for these 23 sectors, and they focus, as I've mentioned in earlier presentations, on how do you innovate in that sector, what you need to globalize, how do you improve productivity, and what kind of skills are needed. And as a former president of a university, I knew very well that once these plans were in place, I had to look at those plans to think about what are the new types of courses that I launch, what are the new types of research programs that I launch, etc., etc. More recently, the government has revised these 23 transformation maps and has included plans for sustainability and resilience. That's the consequence of the pandemic, of course. But the second major pillar on which that is built is a massive investment in mid-career reskilling through something that is called Skills Futures, and where there is more than $1 billion US dollars per year that is set aside for reskilling. Everybody who is above 40 years old and who is a Singapore citizen got in, I think March or April, 4,000 Singapore dollars, 2,500 euros. You just got it, and you have it in your hands to do your own reskilling. No conditions required. Of course, it has to be with recognized institutions by the government, but there are plenty of them in the private sector, in the public sector. And you just have imagine you have 2,500 euros just for reskilling, for learning something new. Whether it's cooking, whether it is flower arrangements, whether it is AI, whether it is Python, whether it is whatever it is, if it's recognized, you can do reskilling. The whole point is really to say it is your responsibility to reskill yourself. It's not for us, the government, to determine what you're going to do. You need to reskill yourself. We make it costless for you, but it's your responsibility to decide what you're going to do. There is a strategic allocation of research funds in order to stimulate research where there is absorptive capacity. There is about 5 billion Singapore dollars, about 3.5 billion euros per year invested in research and development. For a small country, that's a sizable investment. But in the past, it was a bit like let a thousand blossoms bloom. whatever good research there is, we are going to support it. And then you suddenly realize that you have trained, these are the real numbers at some moment in time. In 2015, you have trained 1,600 PhDs in life sciences, and you have no jobs for them. So what they do, they return back to China or the United States, and you have actually trained people for other countries. You can be generous to some extent, is what the government was thinking, but not to the full extent of that. So we need to make sure that we actually reallocate the research funds to areas where our own industry can absorb the output of our research investment, whether it is trained PhDs or master's students, or whether it is the outcome of research projects. And then there is a heavy investment in digital infrastructure. I have a hesitation to quote rankings, but there is this IMD World Competitiveness Report that was just published a few months ago in July or June, I believe, and where Singapore, first of all, comes out as the most competitive country in the world. Living there, I have some doubts, but anyway. But they came out with as number one in terms of digital infrastructure. In other words, it's easy for a city compared to a large country like Australia to have that great digital infrastructure. But it is indeed, there is a very strong investment in digital infrastructure in a similar way to what I saw, what Xiaobo was presenting about 5G, etc. So those are the 4 pillars. Does it lead to any success? Interesting enough, actually a month ago or a month and a half ago, the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and you can't probably read this, but the Ministry of Trade and Industry did an evaluation of what is the real value-added growth of the overall industry transformation maps. And they make the distinction between outward and domestically oriented industry transformation maps. And they looked at how the value added was increasing in percentage per annum between 2016 and 2023. And you see that on the top group, you see overall ITMs, a value added increase of 3.5% per year. But then for the ones that are outward oriented, in other words, that are competing with the outside world, you see that in information and communications technologies, electronics, or financial services, you see a significant increase in value added. Interesting enough, there are some reductions in marine and offshore, which can be explained by the fact that there is 1 or 2 companies like Keppel and Sembawang who have not, who had to stop the production of marine drilling equipment for the oil sector. The domestically oriented industry transformation sectors have grown by 0.7%, basically because there are a few that have actually significant decreases in value added, that is retail, the built environment, and land transport. But then some others like healthcare, etc., have increased significantly. So the point I want to make is, and this is data that I have not gathered myself. This is data that comes from the MTI. I trust them to a large extent, maybe not fully 100%, but they have something to argue here. But there are clearly some positive impacts on a number of sectors of the industrial policy that I was referring to in the previous slide. And let me then come to the last slide of my presentation, this Hong Kong, which for me, if I go back to the 80s, the 90s, 2000s, and even early 2010s, was for me the absolute example of laissez-faire. I still remember that as the person who was actually exploring the creation of a campus of INSEAD in Asia that I went to visit late 1990s, that I went to visit the then chief executive, and said, we want to come to Hong Kong. What are the advantages you can offer us? And he looked at me and says, you can set up business. We allow everybody to set up business, but don't ask us for anything. So laissez-faire, you can do what you want. As long as it's legal, it's fine with us, but don't expect us to do anything for you. While, of course, Singapore was doing a big song and dance about attracting us. And also, I have to say, Malaysia, that word. But you can argue that if there was one example in the world of total commitment to free trade, laissez-faire economic policy, that Hong Kong was probably a good candidate to win that prize. Till 2015, it was quintessentially a laissez-faire approach. And then something happened in 2015, partially under the influence of Beijing. There was the creation of the Innovation and Technology Bureau, which was renamed in 2022, and that's where actually the real transition started. That is, that was created. Guess what? You talk about innovation and technology. You add the word industry to it. Something I had never associated with Hong Kong. You don't manufacture in Hong Kong. It's a service economy. You are going to Shenzhen and Guangzhou to do manufacturing, or Zhuhai or whatever, right? But actually, they suddenly added industry to it to highlight that industrialization was a standing policy function and a work focus of the Bureau. And then in 2022, under the current chief executive, John Lee, there is the promulgation of the Innovation and Technology Blueprint. And you can go into the details, but I here mention only enhance IT ecosystem and promote new industrialization in Hong Kong, attracting manufacturing in Hong Kong. Secondly, enlarge the IT talent pool. It's not so different from what other countries do, industrializing, education. Thirdly, promote digital economy development and develop Hong Kong into a smart city. These are words that we have heard before. And to proactively integrate into the overall development of the country and consolidate the role of Hong Kong as a bridge connecting the mainland and the world. And that goes back to the 14th plan. We're now preparing the 15th plan, but that goes back to the 14th plan, and also to what President Xi Jinping basically said when he came to Hong Kong in his speech to celebrate 25 years of the SAR. But also, obviously, these blueprints have to be backed up with organizations and institutions, and you see a whole range of several new institutions: Innovation and Technology Commission, Digital Policy Office, New Industrialization Development Office, Innovation and Technology Fund, etc., Technology Park. So it's not only talk, it's also putting in place the infrastructure to support that. And I would say the main, I happen to be in the University Grants Committee in Hong Kong, which is, for the British among you, something similar to what HEFCE used to be here in this country. I see very much an orientation to much stronger integration with the Greater Bay Area. The old concept of the Pearl River Delta has completely disappeared, and it's now Greater Bay Area. But that's the strong integration with the manufacturing capabilities of Shenzhen, Guangzhou, Zhuhai, and other places in the Greater Bay Area. And basically, I'm now going to say something under the Chatham House rules, that is sort of the ambition to become a little bit the capital of that region of 80 million people that is the Greater Bay Area. As member of the UGC, I have been able to help in a marginal, I would say marginal, but significant allocation of research funds, research postgraduate positions that for the next triennium that will align with the government strategy of Hong Kong. So also in the research, there is this reorientation of, we are not going to go for 1,000 blossoms bloom, but let's reallocate the resources available to what fits the country, what is aligned with what the country, or in this particular case, the autonomous region wants to do. I'm going to stop here. Can I draw general conclusions? I said from the beginning I was not going to do that, right? And I promise you that I will live up to what I promised. Secondly, is there some commonality? Yes, the word fear is a commonality. That is what you do when you're smaller countries and when you see what's happening in these three large units, whether it's China, United States and Europe. What's left over for us? What are we going to do to build up our own strengths? And you see that all these countries, the third point that I want to make is that most of the countries realize they can't do it on their own. But they don't have yet the institutions that the European countries have with the European Union or other international institutions that can help them, because most of the international institutions are favoring the United States and Europe, right? So there's a big need for review of international institutions. I'm saying this as European. Thank you.